been a lot of great storylines in WWE over the years. Things like Austin vs. McMahon, the Bloodline Saga, and the Yes Movement come to mind immediately. But for all the attention those get, there are some hidden gems which have managed to fall through the cracks and not be discussed enough. But just what are the most underrated storylines of all time? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Walter vs. Ilja Dragunov's feud in NXT UK. Yes, NXT UK, that often forgotten branch of WWE TV during the late 2010s and early 2020s, had some great stuff on it. And of what was found there, arguably the most entertaining was the program between Walter and Ilja Dragunov. But then, why wouldn't this be the case? After all, in these two, you have some of the hardest hitters in wrestling today. Just look at their initial encounter on the October 29th, 2020 episode of NXT UK TV. As a consequence of it taking place in the middle of the global shutdown, was performed in front of an empty building. But somehow, rather than take away from things, the silence only added to the intensity of the affair here, as each stiff blow was heard with full clarity, making the whole thing feel all the more brutal as a result. And that wouldn't be the only time the duo did battle over the NXT United Kingdom title. Given how successful the first one was, it was a given a rematch was going to be booked when fans returned to the arenas, with this being exactly what happened at TakeOver 36 in August of 2021. Of course, that time the match would take place in America on NXT, giving a larger audience a chance to enjoy the brutality which followed. And once it was over, Dragunov would be standing tall as the winner, putting their series in WWE at 1-1. Will he ever get that rubber match on the main roster? Well, while it's not happened yet, we do imagine it will eventually. We just hope that, when it does, it's treated like as big of a deal as it deserves to be and put on a PLE, maybe even a WrestleMania. But the Walter Ilja Dragunov feud isn't the only memorable one NXT UK gave us. No, if we look elsewhere on that show, we'll find another hidden gem which took place in that warehouse in England, the rivalry between Pete Dunne and Tyler Bate. Now, it should be stated that Pete Dunne and Tyler Bate did not first meet in NXT UK at the turn of the decade. As stalwarts of the UK indie scene for years prior to that, they've had many encounters before. But with those encounters never really being televised, it meant most people never got a chance to see them. That would all change once they signed on the dotted line with WWE, however, as at that point more eyeballs would have access to their matches. Obviously then, the two Englishmen knew that this was a big opportunity. So they made the most of it over the course of the 3 singles matches they had in the NXT system during the years which followed. So much would they blow people away here, any of the bouts they featured in could easily have been considered the best WWE match of that year. Take the first one, for example, the one which ended up being the finals of the tournament to crown the inaugural NXT United Kingdom champion back in 2017. That was a hidden gem if there ever was one. And the same could be said about their subsequent clash for the same belt at TakeOver Chicago later that year. Even the various multi-man bouts they were a part of on NXT UK TV only further added to the rivalry between these two. Really, the only bad thing we can say about the program pitting Pete Dunne and Tyler Bate against one another is that it hasn't really carried over to the main roster. No, since joining the main roster during the early 2020s, both men have found themselves teaming up instead as the New Catch Republic. Will we ever see this English powerhouse explode as the pair come to blows once more? It's possible, if not probable, that it will happen eventually. This is wrestling after all. So we guess we'll just have to be patient and hope that, like with Walter and Ilja Dragunov, once the two are at odds again, the match itself is given enough focus. If WWE could do that, then we'd have no doubt both Bate and Dunne could blow away a main roster audience just like they did the NXT UK audience back in the day. But let's move away from the men for now and over to the women instead, as there was a very notable women's program which happened on NXT, which is even more historic if you look back at where each lady has ended up in the years since. That's right, it's time to talk about Rhea Ripley versus Toni Storm. Yes, today each of these wrestlers stand as the biggest women's star of their respective promotions, with Ripley being the biggest female name on WWE TV and Storm being the most over woman in AEW. So it's strange to think that, not too long ago, both were still relative rookies trying to make a name for themselves. Sure, by the time the late 2010s came around, Toni had already found much success over in Japan. But as far as the West was concerned, she was still mostly an unknown. What changed the trajectories of each woman in America then? Well, a trip to the UK as it happened. That's right, it was after the Australians each signed on the dotted line with WWE to be a part of the NXT UK roster that they started getting more TV time. And with that TV time came a feud as both attempted to establish dominance by becoming the inaugural NXT United Kingdom Women's Champion. Who would be able to earn that honor? Well, it would be Rhea Ripley, but this wouldn't be the end of their rivalry. Over the months and years which followed, the two would meet numerous other times. Hell, this battle to be the best would even spill over to NXT in the US at one point after Ripley won that brand's women's title and Toni became one of her early challengers. And as things stand today, it looks unlikely that we'll be seeing the pair lock horns again anytime in the near future, as both are riding high in their respective promotions and seem very happy to remain where they are for some time to come yet. Sure, there's always the possibility one will jump sides as the years go on and we'll see this old feud get reignited all over again. But in lieu of this happening, we'll just have to remember the excellent program they were part of back in those NXT UK days. If nothing else, then it will be able to remind us of how far each woman have come in such a relatively short space of time. But what about feuds which happened on the main roster of WWE? Aren't there plenty of hidden gems there too? Why, yes, there is. And one of them is our next subject as it happens, the beef between Mr. Kennedy and The Undertaker, which took place in 2006 and 2007. Forgotten this one? That's understandable, as it didn't really get a lot of people talking about it at the time. And in the years since, with Mr. Kennedy still being on the outs with WWE, it's not one which gets brought up much in retrospectives. Even when you look at The Undertaker's career specifically, it's pretty lost in the sauce when compared to his feuds against the likes of Shawn Michaels, Kane, or Mick Foley. But that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of fun to be found in going back and looking at it, as there were actually a lot of hidden gems in there. Hidden gems like the first bout between Kennedy and the Phenom at No Mercy in October of 2006. Yes, this was a great match to start off a program which would only get bigger from there, as over the months that followed, Ken Kennedy and Mark Calloway would meet twice more in singles competition, with the next time at Survivor Series in November of that same year having a special set of rules. What were the rules? Well, it was the rarely seen today first blood match, with the idea here being the first person to bleed would be the loser. And to the surprise of many, Kennedy would actually win this one, with that making him 2-0 in the series overall, a clear sign that WWE were all in on him during the middle of the 2000s. WWE would continue giving the Wisconsin native a push by giving him a match with the Dead Man for a third time at Armageddon 1 month later, this time in a last ride match. Yes, clearly the idea behind this whole thing had been to take Ken up to that main event level. It's just a shame then that, for reasons outside of this feud, that would never really happen. No, after slipping back down into the mid-card soon thereafter, Kennedy would end up leaving WWE behind in 2009 to go work for Impact instead. Still though, even if it didn't meet its intended goal long term, it did make a bigger star out of the heel in the short term. And it did give us some fun matches to go back and watch today. But what about our next subject? The time we saw a feud between Edge and Booker T, where they battled over the rights to appear in a shampoo commercial. Yes, there is a lot of fun in this one. How did it all start? Well, it was at WrestleMania 18 when WWE was riding high between the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras that two of the top rising stars of the company would be put in one of the most ridiculous and funny angles of the time. And that was when Booker and Edge both got into a beef over who got to star in a commercial for Japan's #1 shampoo brand. Yes, it might not have been what either expected they'd be doing on a show which would also feature The Rock versus Hulk Hogan, But as Jim Ross has famously said over the years, a key thing any wrestler should learn to do early on is maximize their minutes so that they can take anything and make something out of it. And while the angle itself was ridiculous, the match the pair had was great. But who would be the one who got that spot in the commercial in the end? Well, that would be none other than the rated R superstar. But what about our next entry, another often forgotten comedy storyline, the time Heath Slater faced off against a series of different legends on Raw in the summer of 2012. That's right, we all know that of all the comedy jobbers to ever work for WWE, Heath Slater has to rank pretty high up there, on the same level as the R-Truths and the Santino Marellas of the world. So if we're talking about one of the better comedy angles of the early 2010s, then it should come as a little surprise that he was a part of it. What was this angle? Well, it was that after the fall of the Nexus the year prior, the West Virginian was looking for something new which would give him more TV time every week. And this is what led to him stepping up to various legends whenever they appeared on Raw in the summer months of 2012, with him claiming that he could easily take every one of them in a fight. As you would expect though, this did not lead to good things for Heath. No, each time he challenged a face from the past, he'd end up being embarrassed by the time things were over, as he'd be on the receiving end of a couple squashes. Hell, it wasn't even just in matches Slater got geeked out here. No, while names such as Vader and Psycho Sid would beat him in the ring, sometimes it would just be in a talking segment that the future 3MB member was made to look like a fool, as it happened when he found himself being verbally assaulted by Rowdy Roddy Piper. Yes, whether it was verbal or physical, one thing was for sure, and this was that at the end of the night, Heath Slater was going to go home empty-handed. Sure, he did get the occasional victory over the likes of Doink, but even when that happened, it wasn't like the Pineville native was treated like a real winner or anything. No, everyone watching knew he was going to get his comeuppance all over again the following week, with this all climaxing in him eventually getting destroyed in a matter of seconds by Lita during Raw 1000. How would this affect Heath's future with the company? Not too badly at all as it happened, because from that point on, he would always have a role as WWE's jobber extraordinaire while he was working there. And this saw him regularly get TV time, even if it was only time allocated for him to lose in comedic fashion. But let's move away from the main roster for now, and back over to NXT again, as it's on the Black and Gold brand that we find our next example of a hidden gem storyline. What are we talking about here? The second run on that show from Samoa Joe. Yes, we all know that Samoa Joe's first run on NXT was very successful. After all, it was during this run he had some pretty great bouts against the likes of Finn Balor and Shinsuke Nakamura, all while he was becoming the first ever two-time NXT World Champion. So good was he here, in fact, come 2017, Joe would be called up to the main roster as a full-time member of Raw. That said, the one excellent match he had with Brock Lesnar aside, this was not a run which went particularly well for the big man. So, thankfully then, it wouldn't be the last time the San Francisco native was seen in WWE. No, after he was released for the first time in 2021, he'd quickly be brought back by Triple H, this time to once again serve as a member of the NXT roster. And while this second run isn't quite as well remembered as the first, it remains one worth going back and looking at regardless. After all, even if he wasn't wrestling for the most part, Joe was still able to effectively play the role of one of the more intimidating forces on the show when he was essentially the personal security force for then general manager of the brand, William Regal. And when he was hitting the ring, Joe was proving he still had it in him to be that old badass he'd been back in his Ring of Honor and TNA days. Hell, in the lone bout he had during his final go-around in NXT, he'd absolutely demolished then world champion of the brand, Karrion Kross. And that made him a 3-time NXT World Champion, a record which still holds today as the most times anyone has ever won that particular piece of hardware. Sure, this one would be cut short pretty abruptly when Joe got injured and was forced to vacate the belt. Yes, it was a bit of a disappointing way to end his second run on the developmental brand. But that doesn't mean what came before this wasn't more fun than it's given credit for. No, the truth is, Samoa Joe in NXT version 2 had a lot of high points, even if those high points never quite reached as high as they did during his first run. And it kept him relevant for long enough that he'd eventually be able to jump over to AEW and become a one-time world champion there. But let's move away from him for now and over to another forgotten hidden gem of NXT, this one coming from that same era that Joe found so much success in initially. What are we talking about this time? What else but the time Bull Dempsey got Bull Fit. Okay, we might have to do a little bit of explanation here because while 2015 NXT had a lot of great things going on, things like the classic Sasha Banks Bayley series, the revival of Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn's indie feud, and the rise of Finn Balor, one angle which often gets forgotten is the mid-card run of Bull Dempsey. Who is Bull Dempsey? Well, he was, at first anyway, a pretty generic figure on the developmental brand. But that all changed when he finally found a character, albeit a bit of a comedy one, in August of that year. That's right, after getting mocked for being out of shape by a number of his peers, Bull decided to play into the whole thing by creating Bull Fit, a supposed workout regime which was supposed to show just how he'd gotten so shredded. Of course, the joke here was that he was very much not shredded. And while that didn't do much to sell him as a main eventer or anything, it did make people interested in him for the first time. Yes, not everyone has to be a top-level guy in WWE, as there's always going to be a need for mid-carders, and it seemed like this was the role Bill Dempsey was going to have for a long time going forward. Unfortunately though, that would not be the case. No, after apparently not being happy enough with his progress, Triple H would decide to cut the big man from his contract mere months later in February of 2016, a move which brought the era of Bull Fit to an end with immediate effect. But it shouldn't be forgotten, as it was a fun story to watch, and it gave this mid-carder a new lease on life for a while where he wouldn't have had one otherwise. But what about the other brand of WWE during the mid to late 2010s, an even more forgotten one than maybe NXT UK? Well, that would be the location of our next entry, the hidden gem that was the Mustafa Ali vs. Buddy Murphy feud on 205 Live. Now, we'll understand if you never saw this one as it was happening because, based on the viewership 205 Live got on a weekly basis, few fans were watching it. But that didn't mean there wasn't great stuff happening there. And of that great stuff, possibly the best was the feud between Mustafa Ali and Buddy Murphy. Come on now, if you've been keeping up with TNA over the past couple years, then you'll be aware of how great of an in-ring talent Mustafa Ali is, especially when it comes to high-flying theatrics. And if you've been watching AEW, then you'll have seen Buddy Matthews being just as good as part of both the House of Black and the Hounds of Hell. So it should come as no surprise that both can go in the ring. But sometimes people have chemistry together which makes them better than the sum of their parts, and this was the exact type of chemistry Ali and Murphy had back in 2018. So good were they during the 5 times they locked up in singles action over the course of this year, in fact, that it would be enough to get people talking about 205 Live as a show you had to watch. Honestly, any one of these bouts could have been placed on the shortlist for Match of the Year. And because it was seen by so few at the time, it's made for an excellent hidden gem to go back and check out in 2025. Sure, it might be sad that neither were ever able to break out in WWE, probably because their size meant they'd be afforded few opportunities to do so, but for at least a brief window of time, they were able to shine on a somewhat smaller stage. Is there ever a chance we could see this program run back again? Sure, there's always the possibility Ali gets signed by AEW, or at least gets brought in for a couple of days where he and Matthews can kick things off again, or who knows, maybe both end up back in WWE again one day and they pick up right where they left off there. But even if this never comes to fruition, the feud the two had back in 2018 should be remembered a lot better than it is because it really did represent some of the best wrestling that year. But then, all the examples we've looked at today represent some of wrestling's hidden gems.